thanks everyone for taking the time out of your schedules to participate in today's webinar. This is a webinar about advisor perceptions on ESG investing, presented through our Thought Leadership Initiative here at Zeldis Research in combination with our friends at Schlesinger Group, and also not listed on the slide, Schlesinger's partner is Civicom, who helped us with this element of the research as well. So we're thankful to all of them for their help in phase 2 of conducting this research. Those of you who attended our phase 1 webinar, this is a slide you may be familiar with, but just to justify the purpose of researching ESG, there's been an increase in press, an increase in the amount of assets, an increase in the number of funds. With respect to ESG, really over the last several years, there's been near exponential growth in this area. And correspondingly, we thought at Zeldis that it would be helpful to shed our unique insight and provide some conceptual feedback into the overall research marketplace with respect to socially conscious or ESG investing. And that is the research that we've been conducting really in-house here at Zeldis and sharing today, phase 2. Really, this research has been active for most of the year. So we'll be talking here specifically about some research that was conducted between May and July of 2019. Phase 1 was quantitative research with end investors. There's already been a webinar on this topic. If you're interested in learning more about it, please feel free to reach out to me. My email address is right here, fred@zeldisresearch.com. I'd be happy to share with you some details from that webinar. There are also a few key slides from the phase 1 webinar that are interspersed within today's findings as well, although the primary focus of today's research will be some qualitative webcam focus groups that were conducted just a couple months ago with a mix of advisors. You can see here the specifications for recruitment for the advisors that we recruited into the research. So there were 2 webcam focus groups, really with somewhat different discussion guides, right? Because one was conducted with advisors who have sold or have sold a considerable amount of ESG funds to individual retail investors over the last 12 months. And the second focus group was with advisors who do not sell ESG. We had 11 total participants. 6 advisors were in the ESG group. 5 advisors were in the non-ESG group, and you can see the mix of channels there under the second bullet. Mix of assets under management. Some were younger advisors with smaller books. Others were more seasoned advisors, but a really nice representation of the advisor marketplace as a function of assets under management. 7 male advisors, 4 female advisors, and 8 were Caucasian and 3 were African American. So let's get right to the objectives for this research. There are 5 research objectives that we wanted to understand and we will be walking through in today's webinar. The first are just overall perceptions of ESG among advisors. Content, channels, unmet needs, and labeling, because we realize that there's a bit of nebulousness in the marketplace with respect to naming conventions in the socially conscious and ESG space. Our second objective is to understand benefits and barriers to recommending ESG investments with a specific focus on performance expectations. The third are client perceptions. Do advisors think that clients want to invest in companies which align with their values? Fourth is the ESG client profile, either typical or perceived, depending upon the past experience of the advisor. And finally, a case study in a more specific type of investing. Patriotic investing, which we'll define a little bit later as sort of an offshoot of the values-based investing space. We wanted to get a sense of advisor perceptions, potential for interest, and reasons for potential interest in this patriotic investing concept. So first, what have advisors heard about ESG? So while all advisors are aware of ESG investing and have heard more about it in the last 5 years, experiences and high-level perceptions vary. Some advisors say since 2014 that ESG investments have been a higher priority. This is dovetailed with higher awareness of socially responsible and values-driven causes. You can see a representative quote here, and I should mention that there are quotes really interspersed throughout the report. At Zeldis, our focus in qualitative reporting is to really bring findings to life by using quotes, so I'll mention them where relevant really throughout the webinar. You can see in this quote here that one advisor who sold ESG says that it has become a lot more popular over the last 5 years. And there's been, in his words, a humongous spike since 2014 until now. Additionally, the industry is starting to catch up to client interest, especially among millennial advisors and millennial clients. So it tends to be the case that millennial advisors work with younger clients, and younger clients in particular have interest. And in fact, rating organizations such as Morningstar mentioned in this quote are starting to catch up to this interest on the behalf of clients. That being said, like I mentioned at the outset, we did interview two groups of advisors, and those advisors who don't sell ESG are limited to more high-level conceptual awareness. They're of course aware of the idea of ESG, but they generally lack specific knowledge of the area and have some reservations about the category as a whole. You can see the quote there to the right. It's a nice concept. There's no way to truly say you're socially responsible. That's from an advisor group in our group of non-ESG advisors. So across the board, it can be difficult to find ESG investments which are suitable to sell. This is an overlying theme really throughout our research, is that a big barrier to selling ESG investments is the suitability concern. Firms do vary in their ability to find ESG investments that meet that suitability threshold, and even some of those who work for firms that do offer ESG investments as part of their platform or portfolio suffer from low interest, just low uptake on the behalf of clients. Even for those advisors who sell ESG, they refer to it as a reactive, not a proactive market. Several of the advisors in the group that we hypothesized to be more pro-ESG really were less pro-ESG and more amenable to selling it to meet client needs, so to speak. One advisor here says they really don't look into it. They think it's a topic that's more reactive in terms of advisors than proactive, and that themselves, they're just looking into it recently. Typically, requests to consider ESG concerns, even in 2019, are rare and client-driven, and clients don't often bring it up. This does vary a little bit within the group that sold ESG. In fact, one advisor in that group does attend impact conferences about socially responsible investing. But for every advisor who does do this, there are dozens of advisors who don't. And in fact, among those advisors who don't sell ESG, there's generally even less awareness of sources of ESG product information. Just a little bit of a drill down into sources for ESG information. The advisors in our selling ESG group generally wish there were better sources for ESG. So this information could be a search tool besides Google, such as a Morningstar workstation. Calvert being an exception, there's also a need for more concise and clear information direct from the fund companies themselves. Many of the advisors in our ESG sales group did mention that they wish they had more clear information from the companies that offer ESG investments. So I'm going to bring in some research from phase one here. Again, this is research done with investors, not with advisors. And here you can see that only 4% of the investors we surveyed were aware of the term ESG investing. 29% were aware of the term socially conscious investing. 4% were aware of, 12%, sorry, were aware of both. And those aware of both terms were more likely to work with financial advisors. And 55%, over half of the investors we surveyed, were not aware of either ESG or socially conscious investing as terms for specific types of values-driven investing. And advisors in this phase tended to agree with an investor sentiment. Advisors tend to refer to ESG as socially responsible investing. It's just considered more client-friendly language. Now, I should mention that for advisors who have clients who are more savvy about investing, they're eager to hear from those clients about ESG. And when a client comes into an advisor mentioning ESG, that definitely raises the advisor awareness that this is a client who knows something about the investment marketplace. Terminology is indeed a barrier. A more significant barrier, though, is the inconsistency in the approaches that advisors say fund companies take to creating ESG funds. And here you can see with the quote, there's not a consistent approach to what that really means across companies, whether it's excluding companies altogether or ranking them lower and underweighting them. It's so specific to each provider that I think that's the difficulty for us, is there's no consistency in delivering ESG in mutual funds. And those who haven't sold ESG are aware of both terminologies, but some are unclear of the potential nuances between the two. One advisor in the non-ESG sales group mentioned that ESG is more of a recent term, but they haven't really looked into it, and if there is a difference between ESG and socially responsible investing, they don't really know the specific differences. So even among professionals who should be aware of the nuances between these terms, and you might expect that advisors should be aware of these nuances even if they don't sell ESG, there's actually a lack of awareness of these specific terms. Going a little deeper into terminology, and again, this is a slide that brings back phase one with investors. We found that environmental and social were more appealing among investors in terms of the ESG subtopics versus corporate governance. These are just the more appealing areas of the ESG space in the minds of end investors. We asked advisors a similar question, and advisors tend to agree with investor opinions. They largely believe that the environmental and social concerns are the areas in the ESG space where the ground is more fertile for bringing this up to clients and having clients care about ESG investments. Corporate governance, as you can see, is a little bit less trenchant or a little bit less motivating in the minds of advisors thinking about how their clients think. They just don't feel it's as much of a hot topic versus environmental and social issues in the ESG space. Let's move on now to our second objective, which is to understand benefits and barriers. That is, what makes advisors recommend ESG, what makes advisors not recommend ESG. So benefits to ESG investing are really they're threefold. So the first one is advisors are inclined to give clients what they want, or at least what clients think what they want from a business perspective. Now obviously there are suitability or in some instances fiduciary concerns with respect to advisor-client relationships. But advisors are savvy enough to understand that a big part of keeping clients around is marketing. And really, if a client comes in caring about socially conscious issues and cares about social issues, cares about ESG, it's incumbent upon the advisor, if they seek to earn and maintain the client's business, to give them what they want. There is, in line with some of the cynicism that we heard, even among those advisors who sold ESG, there is also an undercurrent of earnest caring about saving the world along with investing. And there are some clients who want that peace of mind of their investments being responsible in helping the planet. If you're a believer in global warming and the detriments that we are currently doing to our planet, as you can see in the quote here in the middle of the slide, clients care about this, and advisors see this as similarly tapping into this client interest with respect to having investments match client values. In line with this matching of investments with values, it is more important for some clients to align their investments with their values, and believe it or not, than it is to make the most money possible. And one advisor brings up an example of a client driving a Prius, supporting companies in local communities that don't align with their values, not wanting to support those companies. So why shouldn't their investing align with the values that they have, that they practice in their life? So we just talked about benefits to ESG investing. There are also several key barriers to ESG investing as well. The first is the potential for lower returns. And we'll go into this in a little bit more detail in a couple of slides, but there is a perception, if not a reality, that ESG investments have a lower performance relative to non-ESG investments. And this advisor, here the quote on the right, doesn't believe there's anything beneficial about telling their clients to take a lower return on something just because it's in the best interest of the environment. The second is a lack of track record, and for some firms this is a deal breaker, because if they don't, if the ESG fund doesn't show up on their screens, it's simply not something they can recommend. So it's important for advisors to have these funds actually available in order to recommend them to their clients. Without a track record, with ESG funds being newer, it's difficult, if not impossible, to make that happen. Subjectivity is a key barrier to ESG investing, and here subjectivity for some means what to cut out. For others, it means what to include, but there is this overlaying layer of fund selection that advisors are aware of, and it makes them skeptical about the fact that ESG investments could actually work in the sense that they help clients align their values with their investments. And finally, complexity. ESG can lend a whole layer of complexity to the selection process, which advisors are sometimes not willing to do because of the time concerns and the return on their investment in working with their clients. Breaking out the concerns about ESG investment performance by advisor type, we found that the advisors who sell ESG do tend to believe that ESG investments perform at parity with non-ESG. And one advisor here says they don't think there's been a very big difference between ESG and non-ESG companies, at least within the last couple of years. On the flip side, the advisors who do not sell ESG believe ESG funds perform worse. There's a whole conversation in this group, which I won't get into, about the fact that all of the advisors we interviewed in the no ESG sales group really felt that there was a performance issue with respect to ESG investments performing worse. I personally am not a financial advisor, so I can't speak to the fact that they do or do not perform worse, but the perception is there. And from a marketing perspective, that is a serious perception to overcome, especially when you consider that 60% of the end investors that we surveyed in phase one would be much more likely to invest in ESG if they could be convinced that returns were adequate relative to ESG funds. So let me focus on that word there, adequate. Returns do not need to beat non-ESG funds. They simply need to be at parity in the minds of end investors. One more topic to talk about here about barriers, and it's an important one. It's industry standards, and we find that adequate industry standards do not exist for what qualifies as an ESG investment. Socially consciousness is a constantly evolving term. It's difficult for advisors to select funds which meet any specific inclusions or exclusion criteria that clients have. The top quote here on the right relates to the Volkswagen diesel scandal from several years ago as an example of a fund that, if it included Volkswagen, would have included a polluter. To be totally blunt, if there had been Volkswagen in that fund, it would have been entered as a fund of social consciousness, but in reality, when that scandal came out to be, Volkswagen wasn't all that it was made out to be, and they thought investors in a Volkswagen fund were thinking they were doing something good for the environment. It turns out that they were not. So this is another layer of that complexity that I mentioned a couple of slides ago. Choosing an ESG fund is extraordinarily complex, and it's almost impossible, looking at the quote on the bottom, that advisors can pick individual stocks to give them exactly what they're looking for. Let's move on to client perceptions, and specifically, do clients seek investments aligned with values? First, I'll bring in some data from phase one. Again, this is data with investors, not data with advisors. You can see that in phase one, half of the investors I spoke with, or that it took our survey, had never heard of ESG. Another 18% have heard about it, but have heard of it, but don't do anything about it. So all told, almost 7 in 10 have no familiarity with ESG. And again, this is among active investors in the stock market. In line with that, only 8% of the investors that we surveyed report having an ESG or socially conscious fund in their portfolio. That 8% is actually on the higher end relative to some other research that you've seen out there in the ESG space over the last few years. It's on the high end of normal, but it's what we see in our research. So let's move on to advisor perceptions. What do advisors say that clients do? Advisors say that some clients do bring up ESG, but advisors never really bring it up spontaneously. There always needs to be a trigger event in their conversation to suggest that ESG may be a good fit for a client, but even the advisors who sell ESG focus on not bringing it up. This leads to ESG still being considered a niche investment, even among those investors who sell, or even among those advisors who sell it. You can see here the quote on the right. He has 500 clients. He mentions about 3% of those clients who have an ESG investing. So it's a very specific niche in the socially responsible space. And again, many advisors, bring up concerns about the accuracy of the alignment of investments with values. It's difficult to do this. So many advisors try to steer clients in a different direction with respect to ESG. And you can see a quote here from an advisor. She says that it's not the case that we're investing in terrorism or anything with non-ESG. Companies that don't fall into this category aren't terrible companies. It's just maybe their primary business is alcohol or something. Another forward-thinking topic in our research with advisors was asking advisors to think about perceived future changes in the ESG investing space. In this next 5 years or so, advisors think that clients will become more aware and are going to become more likely to proactively mention values-based investing to their advisors. As a result of this, we might see retail clients acting in the future more like institutional clients act today. There are some types of clients who are more likely to bring this up, and institutional clients such as religious organizations are absolutely one of them, just due to having a more savvy nature, greater overall awareness of the marketplace. And one advisor in our ESG sales group mentioned hearing more about ESG from wholesalers and money managers. This is another step that we think is important to bring up or to increase ESG awareness in the future. Our next objective is to better understand the typical or perceived ESG target client. This is a demographic profile from phase 1, which was our quantitative research with investors. We found that among investors, current ESG investors were younger. They were more likely to be millennials. Higher proportion of Hispanic investors. More likely to be male. Higher proportion of urban investors, 38% versus 21% for non-ESG. More financially secure. Higher proportion liberal. More likely to work with a financial advisor. And more likely to be college graduates. Advisors' perceptions of a target ESG investor tend to be exactly the same as what we found in phase 1, but also a little bit more nuanced in terms of their values. So what do I mean by that? So specifically, advisors believe that a target ESG investor should have a strong sense of social justice. That is, someone who's spent some kind of time extending themselves in the service of others, maybe even someone with very strong religious convictions. They should also have a global mindset. Maybe an avid traveler who's been outside of our continent and traveled across the world and seen the kind of disparities, some of the things that we take for granted here in the States particularly. And finally, they would think that ESG investors would be younger and more liberal. So those are some ways in which advisors' perceptions of a target ESG investor actually align with the investor perceptions that we obtained directly in phase 1 of our thought leadership research this year. Last but not least, we have the topic of patriotic investing and how specifically do advisors react to this concept. So you may wonder what patriotic investing is. It's not something that exists in the marketplace, but it was something that we at Zeldis were curious in understanding how advisors and investors thought of something that was maybe a little bit more of a concrete idea relative to the more vague area of ESG. So here's the definition that we gave both investors and advisors. The term patriotic investing could be used to describe investing in companies that have patriotic values such as having Made in America production, offering military and veteran hiring programs, strictly adhering to laws preventing employment of undocumented immigrants, and things of this nature. When we asked investors in phase 1 to rate the appeal of this patriotic investing concept, we found that 43%, almost half of the investors in our survey, found patriotic investing to be extremely appealing. These are top 2 box, 6 or 7 ratings on a 7-point scale. And you can see as a footnote on the left-hand side that we also gave a definition of ESG investing, and ESG ratings were much lower. Specifically, only 27% of end investors found the ESG concept extremely appealing, again, compared to this 43% for patriotic investing. That is a 16 percentage point gap in top 2 box ratings across these 2 different concepts. And you can see on the lower left that our ESG investing definition was not out in space. It just gave a very technical and formal definition of what ESG investing is. So let's go back to advisors. Advisors have not heard of anything related to this concept before, although one did mention a related idea for a Vice ETF, which sort of was used as an example of just how narrow ideas can get in the marketplace these days, but no real awareness of the patriotic investing concept. And advisors consider it an improvement over ESG funds, over many ESG funds, because it's clear about what the fund includes. It's more specific, it's less broad. People can look at it and say, I know specifically what you're trying to accomplish with this particular fund versus something else in the ESG marketplace as contrast. A few of the advisors, specifically in our ESG sales group, mentioned this idea as particularly resonating with some conservatives in America. referring to it as a Republican fund, which may or may not work with their client base, but at least might exist in the marketplace. So what are the benefits and drawbacks of patriotic investing? Well, the key benefit is expanding the target for values-based investing. So if we look at values-based investing as the umbrella term for all the things that we're talking about in today's webinar, that is ESG, socially conscious investing, and patriotic investing, advisors tend to think of ESG as having either an intentional or an unintentional liberal skew. Not all clients are liberal. Yes, particularly in some parts of the country, many clients are not liberal. So a fund appealing to conservatives has indeed some merit. Specifically, the Made in America concept is considered less polarizing than the other aspects of the patriotic investing concept. And this was very much in line with our investor research. Made in America is less controversial, something that should have near universal appeal, so appeal really across the political spectrum for this Made in America tenet of patriotic investing. However, it's important to note that the advisors who sell ESG also tend to have more liberal clients. They tend to be in more liberal-leaning parts of the country. So for them specifically, it's difficult for them to conceptualize selling a product with conservative appeal. So the idea that patriotic investing sort of negatively correlates with ESG is in fact something that these advisors are aware of. Looking at this by advisor type, advisors who sell ESG see patriotic investing as an opportunity to diversify for different clients. They don't see it as a core holding, but they see it as maybe something that they could use as an incidental holding, something on the side that for clients who would like to follow that type of investment even if they don't have a lot of money in it. However, advisors who do not sell ESG are generally more concerned about the concept. I personally am not surprised by that. As the moderator, I do feel that these advisors who do not sell ESG are generally just less amenable to the idea of tailoring investments to values in general. So it sounds like a fad to this one advisor, and in fact, it is the case that there was less uptake in this group for the patriotic investing concept, just speaking qualitatively, than there was even among those advisors who sell ESG. So let's tie it all together. The first key finding that I'd like to spend a few minutes with is that even for advisors who sell ESG investments, ESG is a low-touch niche play with perceived limited applicability, at least at the present time. Advisors don't spend much time on ESG, and as a result of this, there's a potential for lack of knowledge or for areas where ESG might actually apply. We're doing qualitative research here, so the research that we did is not projectable to the advisor base as a whole, but it is the case that with the exception of some advisors who are ESG specialists, the vast majority of advisors dabble in ESG, and they really only bring it up when clients ask for it. Second, there's a ton of confusion in the ESG space, even among advisors. This confusion exists not only around terminology, but also the company selection within funds. All the advisors that we interviewed in this research do inherently mention that difficulty in picking ESG investments, which is compounded by a lack of resources available to identify companies meeting criteria. And the end result of all of this is we end up in a situation where ESG funds are being what we think is underutilized in the marketplace at the present time. The key benefits, third, to selling ESG are providing clients peace of mind. And by that we mean understanding client needs and attempting to meet them through aligning investments with values. I use the word attempting here intentionally because in practice advisors feel it is very difficult to truly align investments with values. There are no guidelines and there are very few resources. There are also critical barriers, and in my opinion the barriers outweigh the benefits in the minds of advisors from what I've learned in conducting this research, including perceived lower returns, lack of a track record, subjectivity, and that whole completely new level of complexity to the task of client portfolio allocation. By the way, the perceived lower returns are both a client issue and an advisor issue because of the suitability concerns and the fact that clients can shop around. On a more positive note, our fourth key finding is that advisors who sell ESG do think the marketplace is evolving, and they expect that there will be an increase in clients coming to them in the future asking about ESG or socially conscious investing. Advisors further think that they'll hear more from wholesalers and money managers about ESG, and a little bit more on that as we get to implications on the next slide. Finally, I think it's illustrative that our concept of patriotic investing has appeal. It has appeal mainly because it's more concrete than most ESG funds and also appeals to a disparate investor group. That being said, if patriotic investing were to ever come to market, whoever took that idea from Zeldis would have to be careful about not alienating clients on the left of the political spectrum. So what can investment companies do? The first thing we think they can do is continue to educate wholesalers. Advisors rely on wholesalers and money managers for information, and only 1 out of 11 advisors interviewed in this research mentioned being contacted by their advisor being contacted by their wholesaler or their money manager for information. Doing this more in the future could lead to increased uptake of ESG investment options if that is a goal. Clarifying definitions with advisors is also important. We were surprised to an extent to see the extent to which advisors were confused about common terminology in the marketplace. This will increase the odds that advisors in some channels will offer ESG investments, but just by being more concrete about what ESG funds are and, more importantly, aren't intended to accomplish. Ultimately, this will get these funds on more approved lists. Finally, educating end investors is important. We don't think that most advisors are going to change on a dime and start proactively bringing up ESG to their clients in the near term. However, educating end investors about what's possible within the realm of socially conscious or values-based investing could be the most direct way to further increase uptake in these funds. In other words, what we're suggesting is getting your clients to reach out to their advisor might be the most direct way to increase awareness of this particular class of investments. So thank you so much for your time today. I'm here with my contact information on the right. You can also see my colleague, Amy Ray. You can reach out to either of us if you have any questions.